This is your first soldering seam. Congratulations. So once you have your solder seam ready to go, the way you know is that it's clean, the metal is not dirty, and what you want to solder is making contact. If it's not making contact, it will not solder together. You'll have a flood of solder everywhere that you have to file off, and filing is boring. Okay, so if it looks like this, it's ready to go. This first solder seam is the easiest solder seam you can do. It's called a butt joint. It's when two edges of metal come together like this, all right? And the way we're going to set this up is the seam is going to be on the top like this, and we're going to put our metal directly on the top here so that we can suck it through into the bottom, all right? Now, the thing about soldering is you can put solder directly on here, and you could sit there with the solder and the torch and only heat up the solder, and it will never flow. The whole entire metal has to be hot evenly on both sides in order for it to flow where you want it to go. So the hardest part of soldering is if you accidentally have this side hot, a little more hot than this side, the solder is going to go over to that side and it's not going to solder together. So you have to really, really pay attention to what you're soldering. So now that you guys have a little bit of experience with the torch and how you guys controlled it with the heat patina, you guys will be pretty good at doing this, I think, okay? So, if you forget steps, I try to put them everywhere. Soldering steps, I'm going to read down these, make sure you understand them. Be sure metal is clean, and they've been put in the pickle. Well, we didn't have to do it because I never heated it up anyways, okay? So, flux. Flux is super important. If you don't use flux, your solder will not flow. Does anybody know what flux does to metal? Or how does it help in soldering? Does anybody know? If I put this flux, and I don't need a ton of it, I'm going to put a line of flux on the top where the seam is, and a line of flux on the bottom. And I'm only putting it on the seam. Anybody have a guess what that might be for? Yeah?
To help heat it more so it can flow.
Very good guess. Close. Flux does help heat it more, but the reason it does that is because it keeps the metal clean. It stops the metal from getting dirty from the torch, and if solder becomes dirty, it won't flow. So you have to do flux. So flux it first, and then you put your little pieces of solder. Now you've probably seen this solder up here, and you're probably like, what in the world are all these letters for? I usually smell out, meh. So for this seam, you're going to be doing hard solder. This is medium solder, and this is easy. Does anybody know what that means? Hard, medium, easy. We're talking about heat. We're talking about things melting. Anybody have a guess? It doesn't mean the easy solder is easier to solder. Anybody have a guess? It is the melting point. Very good. So hard solder has the highest melting point. Then it goes medium. Then it goes easy. So if you're doing two solder seams on this, if you were to use easy solder on here and then try to solder something else with hard solder, what would happen to the easy seam?
Melt.
It would all melt. So you got to think about that. So for this first solder seam, you're going to use what kind of solder then? Hard solder. Very good. Very good. Okay, so when you're putting solder on the seam, you're going to do it as if it is a dotted, who drives in here? Okay, the dotted line in the middle, right? There's a line and then an empty space, and then a line and then an empty space, right? That's exactly how you set up solder. If you put too much solder on it, it will flow everywhere and you'll have a lot of cleanup, and that requires filing and sanding, which is not always the most fun thing to do. So for this wide of a band, I think your bands are kind of a little bit in between this, like thicker or thinner. I pre-cut them for you. That's about how much solder you need. That actually might be a little too much, but do you see the gap, solder, gap, solder, gap, solder? That's pretty good. I'm going to cover this up because if it dumps everywhere, this is actually silver wire mixed with zinc. So it's expensive, and all my aides have to cut this up from a piece of wire. It takes a long time. So try to keep it organized so we don't actually spill it. It's like a bunch of little beads flying everywhere. So now, I am ready to use my torch. you know exactly how to use the torch already. You don't want to use a huge torch tip for this size of metal, right? This size is probably about as big as you would go. This is a size 2, if you're ever wondering how to find that. It has a number 2 on it. This tip is a little bit smaller. Can you see that? This is a size 1. So 1 or 2 torch tip is good. And I'll try to let you know what torch tips, little signs, which one's on there so that you guys know. So 1 or 2 is the right size torch tip to use for this. So first thing I'm going to do, you all know how to when you were heat patining, you were probably experimenting with the whole entire flame, like out here, back here. The hottest part of this flame, anybody know?
The blue.
The tip of that blue. That's the hottest point. So when you're doing this, that's going to heat it up the fastest, okay? But this is a small piece of metal, so maybe take your time, maybe back off about 1/8 of an inch from there, because you want to get it hot equally on both sides. So the first thing I do is I have a really low torch, because what happens is that flux kind of breathes and it kind of pushes that solder sometimes to the side. Did you see how it moved a little bit? So when it gets hot, after it goes through its heat patina process, that flux will get clear. And when that gets clear, you can use something like this. These are solder picks. You see them in ceramics too. They're like little scribes. We use these to kind of push the solder around. So I'll set it up. I can pull that off, and then once it's clear, you can move it. If you don't wait for the flux to be clear, it will be sticky and you can't move it. Now it's kind of liquidy. So I'm ready to go. So I'm going to go slowly around in a circle, paying attention to the heat. It's going to become a dull red right before it goes. See it? And then I'm going to make sure it's sucked through. Now to know if that soldered really well, now if these were hot, these aren't hot, I can put them back in here. If they are hot, like you had it on the heat, you put it over there, right? Copper tongs, quench it. And it's really dirty now, but you'll see the seam on the inside. Where do I put this now?
In the
Your
acid.
finger?
In the pickle acid. Maybe. Got it? All right. Thanks, guys. Good job.